The White House is warning that Russia could be planning a chemical or biological weapon attack in Ukraine. Washington says it's very concerned about the potential for the war to escalate and the possibility that Moscow may deploy non-conventional weapons. Well, to discuss this and more, I'm joined for today's Perspective slot by Edward Arnold, Research Fellow for European Security at the Royal United Services Institute Defence and Security think tank. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Firstly, tell us, how seriously should we be concerned by this threat of potential chemical or biological weapons attacks in Ukraine?
Well, two things. I think, firstly, a lot of these assessments will be on the use of chemical weapons in other areas. So, for example, in Syria, where it was first broadcast that chemical weapons might be used, and then when they were used, it was an attempt to blame it on the other side. And also, we do know that Russia has used chemical weapons. I mean, most recently on the streets of Salisbury here in the UK, where the attempted assassination of the Skripals. And for the US to release this information and sort of make it public, I think they are just preparing the ground for a similar potential use by Russia. So it's really trying to get ahead of the narrative and make sure that if they are deployed, then it's the US can counter that effectively.
And Edward, it seems that Russian convoy, it is now approaching the capital. People are bracing for assault. But Vladimir Putin, according to the CIA, he had planned to take the capital within a couple of days. From a Russian perspective, what has gone wrong with this campaign? And does the army seem to be overcoming its logistical problems now?
Well, I think in terms of the Russian operation, I mean, this really is a poor plan, poorly executed, but most importantly, poorly led. The Russians had been moving their forces in since last spring, all around Ukraine. So it was a gradual and then a sudden build-up, which started to accelerate in December. And I think ultimately that the intelligence that they had, it was either wrong or it was just not listened to. So there was an element of hubris on the Russian part to think that they could just move into the capital within a couple of days and go for a swift regime change. Ukrainian resistance has obviously hampered that, but really the Russians, in the first phase of the operation, in the first 5 days of the operation, nothing went well for them, and they don't actually appear to be following their own doctrine. They are now in phase 2 when the tactics change to more brutal measures. But initially, they really struggled to advance, and when they were advancing, they were pushing ahead of their logistics, and logistics has been one of the key issues for the Russian military thus far.
And the coordination has been poor, as you say, but especially in terms of using air power. Why have we not seen more of that in this campaign to date?
Well, it's important to note that we are seeing an uptick in the use of air power in the last couple of days, but in the initial phase of the operation, in the first sort of 24 to 48 hours, we saw the Russian Air Force operating as we thought that they would, targeting mainly the Ukrainian Air Force in terms of their radar and also their air defense assets. But then after around 48 hours, it was not followed up with the use of overwhelming air power to try and gain superiority and then air supremacy. This allowed the Ukrainian Air Force to remain intact while it was vulnerable. And actually, in the first 5 days of the operation, the Ukrainian Air Force and also their drone use was very effective, targeting especially the logistical convoys. We're starting to see an uptick now in the use of Russian air power, but unfortunately for civilians, as we saw in Mariupol yesterday, they're largely using dumb munitions, so not precision guided munitions, and that's what's causing a lot of the civilian casualties at the moment.
And Russia has also acknowledged for the first time that it's using conscripts in this campaign. What can we take from the fact that these people are being sent currently into combat zones, although the Russian Defence Ministry says they won't be continuing with that approach? What can we take from the use of conscripts in this conflict?
Yes, and there's actually conflicting reports about their use in terms of where they were in Ukraine, and it's important to note just that the start of April will be the second round of conscription. which will probably have an impact in terms of where the war support is within Russia itself. But actually, overall, in terms of numbers, I mean, the Russians have now committed 100% of their operational reserve. So all of the forces that had been amassed in the region prior to the invasion have now been committed to Ukraine. So at the moment, Russia doesn't have an operational reserve. Why is that important? I mean, you need an operational reserve to be flexible and be able to maneuver it where your forces are most needed. The other thing is that Russian forces are bogged down at the moment, and that their advances are slow and slowing, only in some areas, and even in the last couple of days, moving from Sumy to the east of Kiev has been the only real advance. And the problem is with Russian forces and force structure is that when they're static or moving very slowly, they are more targetable and they're taking very, very heavy losses. So they will need to commit more forces to the operation, potentially as early as the next couple of weeks to try and get some momentum. But also for the longer term, I mean, if this moves to a more campaign footing for Russia, whereby they are staying for a number of years, then you need to rotate your troops. So actually the requirement just to have boots on the ground will be significant for Russia. And it's actually unclear how they're going to generate that amount of combat capability.
So you mentioned the possibility that this conflict could continue for years, but how long do you think the Ukrainian military can hold out? How does this play out?
Well, I think it's important to note, just moving back to phase one of the operations, so the Ukrainian military, and it's not just the Ukrainian military. Now with mobilization, it's the whole of society. This is a total defense of the homeland, and Ukrainians are seeing this as a fight for national survival. And actually, in the first 5 days of the operation, the Ukrainian resistance was exemplary, and actually it very much had an impact on European nations and political support for Ukraine at the time. And had they not done that and capitulated within 2 or 3 days, like some analysts expected, and obviously the Russian leadership did, I don't think they would have secured that ongoing support, which continues to come in. The other thing to note about fighting power is there's a physical component, there's a conceptual component, which is your doctrine and how you fight, and there's also a moral component, which is all about leadership and morale. And at the moment, the Ukrainians are far better led than the Russians, and also their morale is very high. One of the key differences between the two forces at the moment is morale, and morale is infectious, be it low or high. And it's a severe worry now for the Russians. I mean, they've lost 2 major generals already and another 2 colonels. I mean, and they will be feeling very vulnerable in some ways. And I think coming back to the leadership point, one of the key determining factors of why Russia has not performed thus far is the fact that they just didn't tell their troops what they were doing until the 11th hour and just before the invasion. And that has had a huge effect on Russian morale.
We'll have to leave it there, Edward, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's Edward Arnold, Research Fellow for European Security at the Royal United Services Institute Defence and Security Think Tank. Thank you so much.